In this video I'll be adding some wall panelling to my brother's bedroom. This project started with a big delivery of materials, and I'm going to start by stacking up all of these sheets of 6mm MDF, and by the way, this has to be the filthiest MDF I've ever purchased. It looked a bit like it had been set on fire. I'm flushing up all of the edges so that I can make my cuts through 3 sheets all at once so that they are all exactly the same size. This 6mm material is going to be used for the backing boards, and I'm cutting them to size so that they're going to fit along one of the walls with a gap of a few millimetres in between each sheet. And there's going to be a lot of sanding on this project, although to be honest I didn't anticipate having to sand the sheets before I'd even got started. Once they were nice and clean, I'm applying a coat of white acrylic primer just to the front face of these backing boards. With that done, next I have some 9mm MDF which I'm going to use for the rails and uprights of the panelling. I make a cut to establish the height of the uprights, and then I can start cutting it into lots of 100mm strips at the table saw. And then using my crosscut sled and a weight as a stop block, I rip my top rails to 100mm wide also. The bottom rails need to be ripped to 194mm, and I'll explain why the bottom rails are wider a little later in the video. For all the rails and uprights, I need to prime all the long edges and the front faces too. The first coat of primer or paint on end grain of MDF always soaks in really quickly and leaves the surface feeling kind of prickly, but before getting it smooth I add another coat of primer just to get a nice thick seal coat. I then get the front faces primed, and once everything is dry I'm denibbing the end grain with 240 grit to get it nice and smooth. I'm also just easing over what will be the front edges so that they're not sharp. This was a long, boring process. With all of the MDF prepared, I still had 3 more jobs before the installation fun begins. First, these 20mm pine scotia rails are going to help support a top shelf and add a decorative element. These need priming too. And secondly, I need to make the top shelf, and I had a 24mm thick piece of MDF that's been sitting up here in my workshop for ages. I'm ripping this down into 65mm wide strips, and then for the front edge I'm going to add a round over detail to both the top and bottom at the router table. And these also need priming and denibbing in the same way as before. Now, because this MDF is only 2.4 meters long and it's going to be going on a 2.9 meter long wall, I'm going to need to join some bits together by cutting a 45-degree angle and then adding a domino just to reinforce the join between the 2 pieces. This join doesn't really need reinforcement, and if I had any CA glue and activator I probably would have used that, but as I'm going to be throwing this in the car later, the domino should help keep it together. And the final preparation job is to sort out these 5-meter lengths of square edge MDF skirting boards. I just need to cut them to length for each wall in the room that we'll be working on, leaving a little bit extra that we can trim down later. I'm mainly making these cuts now so that I'm going to be able to fit these boards into my car. These skirting boards were already primed from the supplier, but to save my brother a job I'm going to work on smoothing the edge grain, which again is very prickly. It's a shame this isn't done by the supplier as well, really. And then I get a couple of coats of some white hard wearing eggshell paint on top. With all of that repetitive work of cutting, sanding and priming out of the way, I can now get the car loaded up with all of the tools and materials that I think I'm going to need and make my way over to my brother's house. We're going to be working around 2 kittens. This is Teddy, Cola was hiding up, and my 3-year-old niece, who is actually a dab hand with the dustpan and brush. So this wall and this wall are the ones we're going to be panelling, and all the old skirting boards have already been removed. And this wall here is just going to have a scotia rail and the shelf added to tie it in with the wall next to it. First I set up a laser level to a few millimeters higher than the height of my backing boards from the floor, and I mark the level with a pencil all the way around the walls that we'll be adding the panelling to. And then it's in with the backing boards. We used packers to lift up the sheets until the top edge lined up with our levelled pencil marks perfectly. And each backing board is going to get secured to the masonry wall with 6 screws and wall plugs. To be honest, a grab adhesive would have been my preference for fitting these sheets to the wall, but my brother preferred the screw option because screw holes are a bit easier to patch up in future should they ever want to remove this panelling later down the line. One of them needed a cutout for a double socket, so I can mark that up and cut it out with a jigsaw. Good to see my brother wearing his safety shoes. 2 screws at the top, 2 in the middle and 2 at the bottom, and soon enough both walls are done. Next we can start adding some of this polymer grab adhesive to the first upright, and I like to work from a centre point outwards on a job like this, making sure that the first one is nice and plumb using the laser level. And then the top and bottom rails can go on, and I can add a few 18 gauge brad nails to hold them in place. The nail holes are also going to be hidden by what is going to sit over the top of them later, so no need to fill these. And you'll see that all of the screws we added earlier are also going to be hidden by the panelling strips over the top of them. So this last upright slots in perfectly at the top of the wall, but because the wall isn't straight at the bottom, I've got an overlap of about 12mm. So I'm going to need to scribe the left hand side to get it to fit. I've packed it out by 12mm at the top, set my compass to 12mm, and I can reference the point of the compass to the shape of the wall, marking up a line onto the upright. I used the jigsaw to cut along the line. And with a bit of persuasion it fitted nicely. The bottom rail needed cutting in around the socket too, as did the upright. This is all going to get caulked in later, so it doesn't need to be perfect. Do your best and caulk the rest, as they say. Eventually we got in a good rhythm with my brother doing the top of the wall and me doing the bottom of the wall. And the last rails were cut down by 2 or 3mm just to get them fitting nice and snug. I should have really been using a mallet rather than a hammer here, but sometimes the nearest tool is the best tool. We added the scotia rail at the top, again just glued and pinned in place. I'm making sure that the top of the scotia rail is flush with the top of the MDF panels. And as you'll see, we needed to join these together to get the lengths that we needed. In the corners we used a mitre bond adhesive, which is basically CA glue with an activator, and I'd actually never used this before, but it seems to work pretty well. The mitres were cut with this mitre box and a handsaw, and we added a little 45-degree return on the end that was on an outside corner of the room just to give it a more finished look. Then it was on with the top shelf piece, which again was glued and nailed in place from underneath. And then it was just a case of filling those small nail holes and then adding some decorator's caulk to close up any gaps. Here's that return detail. Here's the join on the shelf, the join on the scotia, and the corner mitres, which will all look much better than they do currently once they're all painted. As I was leaving, we managed to get a couple of bits of skirting on the wall, just so that the bed could be pushed back into place for that evening, and here's how the socket looked once it was all caulked in. And for me, that's the job done, but I'm sure you're all keen to see the next steps, so now over to my brother. I mentioned earlier in the video about the bottom rails being cut to 194mm, and that's because these skirting boards are 94mm, leaving us with a 100mm reveal, which matches the top rails and uprights. And then it was on to skirting the rest of the room and painting. This project took about a day in terms of preparation, that excludes the time waiting for the paint to dry by the way, and about a day to install, but it's worth noting that we did the installation on one of the hottest days of the year, so we probably could have got it done a bit quicker. In terms of costs, we were lucky enough to get a really good trade discount on the materials, so the cost was around £220 all in. If you were buying the materials from one of the big DIY shops here in the UK with the prices as high as they are at the moment, I've done the maths and it comes in at around £315, and that breaks down as £176 for the MDF, £108 for the skirting boards and £30 for the Scotia rails. But as always, it's worth shopping around to find the best prices you can. Please subscribe for more videos, thank you to my channel supporters, and thanks for watching.